Today, the topic we're going to discuss is CR in the verbal section. And there's a rather unique type of question called archaeology questions. Now, archaeology questions doesn't mean questions that have appeared in the past, but rather it refers to questions whose stories are about archaeology, about using present-day evidence to uncover events or dynamics from the past. These kinds of questions are ones that many students often don't know how to approach when they encounter them. So today we're going to teach everyone some common ways of thinking about these questions. Why are these archaeology questions so difficult? Actually, there are a few reasons. The first reason is that archaeology questions are not really related to our daily lives. Because of this, it's hard for us to use the method of putting ourselves in the situation to think through the problem. For example, you can't exactly put yourself in the shoes of a vase or imagine yourself as a fossil of a plant or animal. When you can't relate to the scenario, it becomes much more difficult. Thinking about it isn't so intuitive. That's the first reason. The second reason is that often there isn't a clear cause and effect relationship. Unlike when we're working on solution-oriented questions where taking certain actions leads to specific results and there's a strong causal link you can use to reason through the problem, archaeology questions usually just require you to find connections or associations. So you'll feel that this type of practice isn't so easy to think through. The third reason is that archaeology questions might deliberately include certain subject-specific terms like the name of a particular species, a certain dynasty, or a specific group of people. These subject-specific terms tend to stick in your mind exactly as they are, and you can't easily convert them into more familiar concepts, which slows down your reading. That's why when many students encounter archaeology questions, they often wonder, why is this so difficult? It feels like there's no clear direction or pattern for thinking through these questions. So today, we're mainly going to help you by providing 5 different approaches you can use to tackle archaeology questions. Let's first take a look at what these 5 approaches are. For each one, I'll explain it in simple, easy to understand Chinese, and I'll also give you examples from everyday life. Once we understand these are logical methods. After that, we'll look at the questions themselves. Now, let's look at the first approach. How should we think about it? The first direction is called the validity of the source, or source validity. So what does source validity mean? To sum it up in one sentence, what is the source of your evidence? Where does the evidence come from? For example, you can think about this. In the passage, the author presents a piece of evidence and uses it to draw a conclusion. So where did this evidence come from? Is it just some random evidence they grabbed, or is it possibly fabricated? Or maybe this evidence isn't actually representative, it might just be a small piece. And in reality, you might still be missing a lot more information. For example, we need to consider whether the sample size is reliable. If you only see one example, you can't just generalize from a single leaf to the whole autumn. You can't take one leaf and claim it represents the entire forest. Also, does this evidence reflect the situation of everyone at that time, or just a portion of people? For instance, I can't just see that there were vases in the Qing dynasty and then claim that every household had a vase. It might have been that only the nobility or aristocrats had vases at home. You can't just forcefully generalize and say that this was the universal situation. All right, so when you see evidence mentioned in an article, we can think about it from 3 perspectives. The first perspective is, where does this evidence actually come from? Is it reliable? The second perspective is whether the amount of evidence itself is sufficient. Is there only one piece of evidence, or are there more pieces from other sources that can help us verify it? Often when we want to strengthen our argument, we can look for more evidence. For example, we find one piece here and another piece there. When we have 2 or more pieces of evidence, our case becomes stronger. Then our conclusion will be strengthened. The third point is whether this evidence only points to a small group of people or a specific situation, rather than representing the whole world or the entire society at that time. Let's use another example. Suppose a friend tells you, hey, I heard from a doctor that drinking coconut water is good for my allergies. Naturally, you might ask in return, what kind of doctor? Is the doctor a specialist? Or is it, say, a pediatrician or an ENT doctor? If it's a physical therapist from a nearby clinic telling you about allergies, do you think that's credible? Or if you only listen to the opinion of a single doctor and take that as your conclusion, is that really enough? This is what's called the issue of source validity. If the sources are too narrow, then they lack representativeness. That's the first point. The second point is what we call temporal alignment. Alignment here means consistency or matching, and temporal refers to time. To put it simply, in Chinese, it means whether your conclusion and your evidence are aligned in terms of timing. Whether they match in terms of timing means whether the events you claim happened at that time are consistent with the conclusion you present. Are they matched in terms of timing? That's the first point. Next, are all the sources you provide consistent in terms of time? For example, is it possible that you cite something from the Qing dynasty, then something from the Yuan dynasty, and then something from the Han dynasty? For example, you take things from the Han dynasty, things from the Qing dynasty and things from the Yuan dynasty, put 2 or 3 of them together, and then tell me that this is what Chinese history is like. But the problem is what existed in the Han dynasty might not have existed in the Qing dynasty, and what existed in the Qing dynasty might not have existed in the Yuan dynasty. You can't just say, for example, the Yuan dynasty had paper money, the Han dynasty had bamboo slips, and the Qing dynasty had the Great Wall, and then tell me that all 3 of these things have always existed throughout Chinese history. It's very possible that by the Yuan dynasty, there was paper money, but the Great Wall was gone, or by the Yuan dynasty, the bamboo slips had disappeared. So you need to make sure that the time periods of your sources are consistent. And you also need to make sure that the events you ultimately want to present and the evidence you provide are from the same time period. Let's take another everyday example. Suppose today, the police are investigating a case and they find a shopping receipt next to the victim. They notice that the time printed on the receipt is 8 p.m. The receipt shows the checkout was at 8 p.m. Then the police discover that the suspect's phone location records show that at that time, say at 7:45 p.m., he was at the hospital. The hospital's emergency registration records also indicate that at 7:45 p.m., he was still at the hospital seeking medical attention. Moreover, there was also a beeper at the time. So doesn't this mean the timing doesn't match up, right? Your evidence shows that the suspect was at the hospital at 7:45 p.m. for a checkup, and a medical record was even issued. Meanwhile, the victim at the other location was still shopping at 8 p.m. If the timing doesn't match, then you can't make the connection. You can't just say, oh, this person is the perpetrator. This is very common. What we're talking about here is an alibi. But this particular alibi is a temporal alibi, meaning it's based on time. The third type is called geographical uniqueness, which means that both time and place spatio-temporal context are logical concepts often tested in archaeology. In fact, what we just discussed about alibis, let's consider this from an entirely different angle. For example, today, when we conclusively verify that the victim tragically died at home, but then we unexpectedly discover that the primary suspect clearly wasn't present at home at that precise time, he was actually somewhere else entirely. If the locations are different, then what does that confirm? It confirms that, oh, he isn't the murderer. So in Chinese, what we're really saying is this location the only possible place where this event could have happened? So we will ask a few questions. First, is this location uniquely related to the event? For example, if the body was found by the river, but later it turns out, oh, the person had already been dead for a long time. So it's possible that first, the actual scene wasn't the riverside. The scene could have been at home, in a factory, or somewhere else. In this case, we can't just use the evidence found by the river to identify the suspect. We might also need to find other evidence, the actual primary crime scene, or all possible primary scenes, and see what evidence is there. Only then can we deduce what characteristics the suspect might have. Also, we need to consider whether similar evidence appears in other places and whether this location fully matches the physical evidence we have in hand. Other fact means whether the physical evidence is completely connected to this place. For example, if we find a vase, we might think that this person has been to China. But the problem is this vase might not only exist in China, it could also be found in Mongolia. It could also be found in Japan or Korea. We can't just assume that because this item exists, the person must have been to a certain place. This is about geographic uniqueness, whether the location and the conclusion you want to draw have a one-to-one relationship in reality. Of course, if you want to refute it, you need to prove that there isn't necessarily a one-to-one relationship between them. So what is the fourth approach? It's called alternative explanations. And actually, this is very common. We see this not only in archaeology questions, but in many contexts. For example, you see this piece of evidence now, but this evidence, can it be explained by reasons other than the conclusion itself? For example, if you see a vase in someone's home, you might say, oh, this person must really like flower arranging, so they bought it. But it might not necessarily be that they bought it. Maybe someone else who likes flower arranging gave it to them. Or perhaps the vase is simply being used as an art piece, or even as a kind of valuable asset like a security. Just because there isn't a famous painting at home doesn't mean the person really appreciates art. There could be other possibilities. Maybe the famous painting is being used for money laundering. So what is this called? This is called an alternative explanation. Are there any other reasonable hypotheses that could explain this phenomenon? Also, can you rule out other possibilities? Let's take another example. Say you see someone at a crime scene. He's running nearby, covered in sweat. You might think, oh, he's the culprit. He just committed the crime and is trying to escape, which is why he's running away all sweaty. But in reality, maybe he was just out for a morning jog nearby and was heading home, right? The evidence you saw was simply that he was running and sweating profusely. This is what we call seeing the whole situation. But the cause you infer is just one possible explanation. You might think it looks like he committed the crime, but maybe he was just out for a morning run. This is what's known as an alternative explanation. Now, the fifth point is a bit special. The fifth is called observation omission. So what is observation omission? Here, we need to introduce you to a reasoning method commonly used in logic. It's called if P, then Q. If P is true, then Q must also be true. This is a very common form in logic and linguistics, especially in deductive reasoning. It's about deriving a necessary condition from a sufficient condition. But logically, what can't we infer? We can't infer if not P, then not Q, that can't be inferred. And what about if Q, then P? That's the converse. And we can't infer that either. That can't be inferred either. So what is the only thing we can infer? The only thing we can infer is not only do we reverse the direction, but we also have to negate both sides, which is if not Q, then not P. This is the one that always holds true in logic. The others are not necessarily true. Let's explain with an example, shall we? If it rains, then things on the ground will die. Can you say that if it doesn't rain, then the ground would definitely not be wet, that the ground would definitely be dry? You can't say that because there are many other reasons that could make the ground wet. Will the ground die if it rains? Then can you say that if we see the ground is wet, it means it must have rained? Not necessarily, because as we just discussed, there are alternative explanations. There are many reasons why the ground could be wet, not just rain. But in logic, what is the only thing that always holds true is that if not Q, then not P is valid. So if not Q, then not P is always valid. For example, if it rains, then the ground gets wet. Therefore, if the ground's not wet, it means it definitely did not rain. This is something that always holds true in logic. So based on this logic, we can start to think further. If something happens, what kind of evidence should it leave behind? If we're writing this as a primary scenario, let me help you write it in Chinese first. If something happens, then there must be certain evidence left behind. Conversely, if there is no evidence, it means it didn't happen. For example, at a crime scene, if this is the primary crime scene, there should be blood stains here. There must be traces of blood left behind. Assuming this statement is correct, then conversely, if we can't find any traces of blood here, we can basically rule out this place as the primary crime scene. So looking for these kinds of crucial connections and evidence becomes our task. Just like recently, there was a news story saying that we might really be on the verge of discovering life beyond Earth. I don't know if everyone has been following this news, but they found something a few hundred light years away. It's a planet. And they said that the evidence of life wasn't that they actually saw living organisms, but that they detected a special compounder, special organic compound. So what is it on Earth? If there are living organisms, they will produce this compoundingly living organisms can produce this compound. So he believes that seeing this compound could mean there is life, or it could indicate that there are living things over there as well. In this way, it's an indirect piece of evidence. It's just like we mentioned earlier, if there's a murder case, there should be bloodstains here. If we don't see any bloodstains, it probably means there really wasn't a murder here. Now, we know these these 5 directions. Let's review them again. First, the evidence he provided, let's first consider. Where does this evidence come from? Does this evidence have representativeness? What if later on we find that another option provides the opposite kind of evidence? Right? That means your statement lacks representativeness. Or if another option provides more evidence similar to yours, people often say, this can strengthen my conclusion. Second point, do the conclusion and the evidence actually match in practice? If what we ultimately want to prove today is when a certain event happened, then we need to pay attention to this point. Third, if you try to link the evidence with a location, then we need to consider whether this location is truly related to this event and whether it has a unique connection to this evidence as well. This is the third point. The fourth is when you try to use this evidence to explain an event. So you assume that the event must have occurred at that time. In that case, we need to consider this. Is it possible that this evidence could point to other events, not necessarily the event you are talking about? The fifth point is that if we want to prove that something happened at that time, we need to find the key evidence that could have resulted from that event. If the key evidence is missing, it means that the event may not have happened. All right, we will use these 5 points interactively in a moment.